Hey guys, it's Papa again, and I've got The Sign of the Crooked Arrow, Chapter 2. When we left Frank and Joe last time, they had just walked back into Slow-Mo's garage, and Slow-Mo was getting socked by a burly stranger and hitting the floor with a thud. Let's find out what happened. Chapter 2, Daylight Robbery. Frank and Joe rushed forward. The burly stranger, surprised by their sudden entrance, halted abruptly. Then he whirled about and raced out the side door of the garage. While Frank bent over Slow-Mo, his brother tore after the man, who made a beeline for the railroad station. Both boys were now certain they had stumbled upon a real case. The youths, still in high school, had started solving mysteries when one they later called the Tower Treasure had come their way. Since then, they had been doing detective work, not only in the Bayport area where they lived, but in other places as well. Recently, they had discovered the reason for the mysterious water shortage in town, but only after some narrow escapes while solving the secret of Skull Mountain. Now, Joe was running after a man who gave every evidence of being involved in some crooked dealing. The boy was only a few yards behind him as he raced up the wooden steps of the old Pleasantville station, 3 at a time. At that moment, a train was pulling out. With a lunge, the man grasped the handrail on the last coach, teetered precariously a moment, then pulled himself aboard. By this time, the train was moving fast. Joe missed his man by inches. In disgust, he returned to the garage and told Frank, who was bathing Slow-Mo's head with cold water. "How is he?" asked Joe. "He's coming to," Frank replied. As the boys watched, Slow-Mo's eyes fluttered and opened. "Where am I?" he replied in a daze. "In your office," Frank replied. "Take it easy." "I remember now," the man said. "Big guy hit me. Where'd he go? Did he get the car?" When Frank told him the mysterious stranger had escaped, but without the car, Slow-Mo breathed a sigh of relief. "I'm glad he got away. He might have hurt you boys. I wouldn't want anything to happen to Fenton Hardy's son on my account." Assured that Slow-Mo was well enough to be left, the boys drove off to the police station to tell Chief Jake what had happened. "I'll send out a 7-state alarm," the officer puffed. "Nobody can come into Pleasantville and sock my brother-in-law." A few minutes later, Frank and Joe left the police station and headed back to Bayport. "I don't like the looks of this, Joe," Frank said, frowning. His brother agreed. "What's your guess? Think it really is that man's car?" "No. Probably trying to collect it for the fellow who left it." "Then why the big rush to get out of the garage? I'll bet he was trying to steal the car." "What I want to know," Frank declared, "is who took the license plates and obliterated the engine number." All the way back to Bayport, the brothers tried vainly to figure out what was back of the mystery. "Perhaps Dad can," Joe said as they reached home and entered the Hardys' driveway. The boys hurried into their father's study and found him seated in a red leather chair, poring over a dossier of criminal records. When his sons entered, the detective laid the papers aside. "Hello, boys," he said. "How did you make out at Slow-Mo's?" Joe turned a chair around and straddled it, while Frank sat on the edge of his father's desk. Mr. Hardy knew something was in the air. "Well, tell me," he urged. "Have you two run into something hot?" "Dad," Frank said seriously, "there's something crooked about that abandoned car out at Slow-Mo's place." Fenton Hardy raised his eyebrows and sat forward in his chair. Frank told his story, then showed his father the worn watch strap and the crooked arrow tie clasp. "What do you make of it, Dad?" Joe asked impatiently. "Boys," replied Mr. Hardy, "I believe you dug up some clues which may tie in with the case I'm working on. A very baffling case." "What's that?" Frank put in, amazed. "You've been reading about the wave of robberies in and about Bayport, haven't you?" The boys nodded as the detective went on. "The Businessmen's Association has engaged me to apprehend the criminals. They think the police are a bit slow," he said, smiling. "The Bayport Times believes an out-of-town gang is committing the robberies," Frank said. "Yes, I know, but I don't agree with the Times," replied his father. "I'll admit it does look as if a mob of thugs might be at the bottom of it, because each of the thieves answers to a different description. In fact, that's the police's theory. But I feel there's a marked similarity in each of the crimes, and there may be one person directing the whole thing." "A ring of thieves isn't usually so large anyway, is it?" Frank asked. "Exactly," Mr. Hardy said. "Thieves operate alone or in small groups. Otherwise, there would be too many to share the loot." "Are these papers the records of the robberies?" Joe asked, pointing to the sheaf on the desk. "Yes," the detective replied. "They're statements from the victims, which include bank tellers, cashiers in stores, and citizens robbed on the street while carrying large sums of money. I find that in each case the same thing happened. Immediately after the victims had been accosted, they became faint and lost consciousness. They woke up a few minutes later, minus whatever of value they had with them." "What made them faint?" Joe asked. "That's what I'm working to find out," Mr. Hardy said. "The victims were not held up in the true sense, but it's evident to me that in every instance the man who stopped and questioned and asked a question was one of the thieves." "What did they ask?" "Various things. What time it was, where a certain bus stopped, or in several cases, for a match to light a cigarette." "Dad," Frank put in, "what makes you think this case of yours ties in with the mystery of the car at Slow-Mo's?" Vinton Hardy smiled. "The crooked arrow tie clasp," he said. "The only clue I've picked up in my case was from a recording machine I concealed in a cheap restaurant on the waterfront called Mike's Place. It's known as a hangout for shady characters." Someone used the words crooked arrow. "Crooked arrow," Joe repeated. "What do you think it means?" Mr. Hardy shrugged. "Maybe a symbol or a sign of a gang." Okay, let's get back to the story. Just then, a tall, angular woman strode through the door of the detective's study. "Hello, Aunt Gertrude," the boy said, rising and offering her a chair. "Hello," she replied, then blurted out, "Shame on you, Fenton Hardy. I just heard you talking about a new case. So that's why you're not going out west to help our poor cousin Ruth." Aunt Gertrude, Mr. Hardy's unmarried sister, lived with the family most of the time and felt it necessary, since Mrs. Hardy was so easygoing, to keep the male members of the family in line. At present, Mrs. Hardy was away on a visit to the home of a girlhood friend in a nearby town. Aunt Gertrude was a person with decided opinions, and right now she was wrought up about the plight of their widowed cousin Ruth. Ruth Hardy was having a hard time running her late husband's ranch because of a mysterious situation which had developed. "If you don't go out there soon," Aunt Gertrude said, "I'm going myself." I'll take care of Cousin Ruth in a few days, Mr. Hardy replied. Sit down, Gertrude, and hear about this new case of ours. I'll not listen to a word of it, she said emphatically. With poor Cousin Ruth out there alone with a lot of dishonest ranch hands who'll likely murder her any minute. I don't believe it's that bad, Mr. Hardy said soothingly. But anyhow, I'll go out and see Cousin Ruth within a week. Is that all right? Well, see that it's soon, Aunt Gertrude sputtered. And don't you boys go getting your father involved in one of your cases either, so he can't leave. With that, Mrs. Hardy popped out of the room as quickly as she had entered. Frank and Joe grinned. Guess you got your orders, Dad, Frank remarked. Don't know as I blame her for worrying, Mr. Hardy said. Cousin Ruth is in a tight spot, and I really should get out there and help her. Secretly, Frank and Joe wished they might accompany their father to Ruth Hardy's ranch in New Mexico, but he had not suggested that they go along. Though they already had planned a camping trip with their stout, good-natured friend, Chet Morton, the boys would gladly have postponed it in favor of a trip out west. Dad, Frank said, how about taking this piece of strap to a laboratory for analysis? Perhaps we can find out what sort of person wore it. Good idea, his father agreed. It was too late that day to carry out Frank's suggestion, but early next morning Frank and Joe took the strap to a chemist in Bayport. He knew the boys well and promised to have the analysis for them in 24 hours. Frank and Joe hopped into their car and started home. As they rode along a residential street on the outskirts of town, a stoplight flashed on, and Frank brought their car to a halt. At the near corner, they noticed two men in conversation. As the boys waited for the light to turn, one of the men on the sidewalk walked away. A moment later, the second man suddenly slumped to the sidewalk. The other stranger turned and ran back. He bent over the stricken man briefly, then propped him up against a fire hydrant and hurried off again. Well, what do you know about that? Frank remarked. That fellow may be ill. We'd better help him. The boys jumped out of the car and helped the man to his feet. As they did, he shook himself vigorously. Hey, let me alone, he ordered. What do you hold me for? You collapsed, Frank told him. Your friend didn't wait. How do you feel? My friend, the man asked. The one you were talking to, Joe said. He wasn't my friend, the man said as if irritated by the suggestion. He just asked me for a light and... Suddenly the man felt his hip pocket and looked startled. Then he grabbed Frank and Joe and bellowed, Help! Help! I've been robbed! Arrest these boys! And that's the end of chapter 2. Uh-oh, looks like Frank and Joe are in trouble this time. What's going to happen next? You'll have to wait till tomorrow because I'm not going to record another chapter till tonight. But I'll put it up for you tomorrow. You guys listening? I don't know if I can see y'all in there. Okay. I love you guys. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.